More recently, we had a photo that became famous from Europe of a little boy who drowned and his body washed up on the beach in Greece.
One of the big questions or one of the big pressures rather, that's being placed on Twitter and Facebook and 4chan is to identify and take down some of these images, some of these memes.
One study in France, they found that individuals are willing to sign up to be organ donors when the person soliciting the donation wears a Christian cross.
What is it about the online environment that seems to feed radicalization these days? Hi, this is Phil Gurski, President and CEO of Borealis Threat and Risk Consulting in Ottawa, Canada, and you're listening to Canadian Intelligence, a podcast about all matters related to national security and public safety. You've heard me talk a lot over the last couple of years about radicalization to violence as sort of a precursor to terrorism, and I've complained about how I don't like terms like self-radicalization and lone wolves. I think they're not very accurate terms, and how that radicalization is very much a social process as well as an individual one. Each person arrives at a violent end by his or her own means. The other thing that I've always had a struggle with was what is the actual role of the online environment? I've always thought that, yes, online is important, but it really is who you know and how you get in touch with that person. And in my experience working in security intelligence, that was usually in the real world, where you would meet somebody over coffee or whatever, and that would sort of kickstart your radicalization process to agreeing to carry out an act of terrorism. I must admit, I'm learning a lot still about this particular phenomenon. And I had the pleasure last week of listening to a presentation by my guest at the CASIS Vancouver conference. Now, CASIS stands for the Canadian Association of Security Intelligence Studies, and the Vancouver branch put on one hell of a conference last week with speakers from around the world. I was one of the speakers, but it was this presentation in particular that had me really curious about online radicalization and the creation of sort of cultures and images that help to cement these relationships. So I'm absolutely delighted to invite to the podcast Dr. Sophia Moskalenko, who is an associate with rather research fellow at the National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Responses to Terrorism, also called START, which is a very famous program in the United States. And she has done a lot of research in the United States on terrorism and radicalization. So, Sophia, thanks very much for joining me on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Let's start off with one of your slides from the conference, which really kind of piqued my interest. You talk about mass identity manipulations. Can you explain to me and my audience what you mean by that?
Right. So, Clark McCauley and I were interested in mass radicalization. So, the kind of radicalization that can happen to any one of us, not just terrorists. The radicalization that happens on a large scale. And we found that sometimes things that make that happen, that move people from kind of politically inert to sympathizing with a cause, from sympathizer to a supporter, are kind of trivial. And we were baffled by how trivial these different things are. And we ended up assembling a collection and trying to understand each of those things. But we termed that whole assembled collection MIMS, which stands for Mass Identity Manipulations. And it's a diverse group. So it includes things like songs and chants, the kinds of things that you can scream at a rally with a bunch of people doing the same around you. It includes rumors. It includes collective ritualized movements, so marches or dances, even waves at a stadium. It includes pictures or photographs and symbols and slogans. So, like I said, it's a very diverse collection, but what unites it is the fact that these are all kinds of messages that combine cognitive simplicity, so they're really simple and easy to process, and they have an emotional power to kind of shortcut through all the nuance and detail of political issues straight to the heart of mass identity, whether that is your national identity, your ethnic identity, your religious identity, political identity. So that's MIMS, MIM.
Okay, a couple of things I want to pick up on. You talked about these things, and you and Clark McCauley. By the way, I should have mentioned Clark McCauley is one of your collaborators. I've met Clark. He's been a longstanding scholar on radicalization and these types of issues in the United States. What is it about? You say you use the word trivial. What do you mean by trivial, and why were you so surprised by it?
Well, so for example, one example we discuss in our latest book is the French song, the famous song La Marseillaise, right? So it's a song
Right.
we've all heard it. We kind of know how it goes. What's interesting is that a French general about 100 years ago said about it that it's worth 1,000 soldiers in a battle for how it's able to rouse the troops, inspire them, and lead them in the fight. And so, how can a song be worth 1,000 soldiers, right? Or how can a symbol, whether it's a Heil Hitler or a painted swastika or even a red MAGA hat, the kind that Trump supporters wear, um, how can it be so powerful as to change people's opinions and maybe even inspire some behaviors that they wouldn't have engaged in before being exposed to it? So same goes for rumors. Like we intellectual people, especially academics, we tend to kind of dismiss these things. We want something that is clearly related to ideology, right? Everybody wants
Right.
to think about terrorists that they're guided by some really deep thoughts and convictions.
Mhm.
And if that's the case, then how can a rumor sway somebody's behavior? How can a red hat make somebody do something that they wouldn't have otherwise? So, yeah, trivial and yet very powerful. And that's the kind of conundrum that kept us interested.
I'm glad you raised that point about ideology, Sophia. Certainly, in my work, and as an intelligence analyst, I had to understand the underlying ideology. So, in my case, looking at Islamist extremism, I read all the works of Syed Qutb. I read all the works of Maududi. I read all of Olaki's stuff. I mean, Abdullah Azam stuff. I mean, I read all of it.
Mhm.
And yet, the average idiot, at least in Canada, and I think probably largely in the West, who went on to join groups like Al Qaeda or ISIS or Al Shabaab, they couldn't spell Qutb and they couldn't spell Azam. They never heard of these guys, and yet
Mhm.
they were somehow drawn into this larger framework, this larger, violent ideology. You also talk a lot about, identity, and you made a good point, I think, during the conference that we are all multiple identities simultaneously. So I am, for example, I'm Canadian. I'm a husband, a father, and a grandfather. I'm
Mhm.
also slightly left leaning, which surprises a lot of people, thinking all intelligence people are right wing knuckle dragging Neanderthals.
Mhm.
Uh, and I'm a really bad goalie in hockey. So, what is it about these types of memes or symbols or images that you think leads to people to adopt, or to maybe not adopt's the wrong word, to consolidate these identities?
I'm not sure I'm ready to agree with the word consolidate, just because identities sometimes overlap and sometimes they are in conflict, right? So, for example, um, an American identity may be in conflict with a Republican identity if, you know, supporting one means supporting democratic process and supporting the other might mean kind of holding it back.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so I think what memes do is bring one identity to the forefront of the person's I- momentary attention, focus, emotional grip. What makes these mass identities also really interesting to study is that, unlike the more face-to-face individual identities, like being a father or a member of your PTA or a husband, these mass identities, they're so impersonal. We never know
Mm-hmm.
all the people who belong to the identity we also belong to. And what's more, they're really diverse. So some Americans are really different than I am, which leaves a lot of room for selectively picking and choosing which facts, which ideas, which commitments I can make as an American. And the other really interesting thing about mass identities is that they're by design irrational because we get so very little for belonging. Let's say you're a Christian. Well, that means limiting yourself in certain ways in your behaviors, maybe some foods on certain days or weeks. Maybe you need to get up early on Sunday to go to church instead of sleeping in. So, all those things are little sacrifices that you make for the mass identity. What do
Right.
you get in return? Really, nothing that economists would write home about.
Hmm.
So the fact that these identities are irrational mean that they appeal to our deep-seated emotions. Um, the reason we want to have them is not because we get some tangible benefits, but rather because by belonging we get to vicariously feel like we're great and invincible and will go on forever, and so nothing threatens us as far as disease and decay and death. Um,
Hmm.
and so these trivial symbols and songs and chants, they have the power of kind of luring out of your large collection of identities that one mass identity, and bringing it to the forefront of your attention, and then you're more willing to sacrifice for it, act out on your beliefs, engage in more close interactions with other members of this identity, things like that.
That makes sense to me, and I'm wondering if we could. I want to pursue this a little bit. If I'm a leader or a leading figure, let's say in an extremist group or a violent extremist group, it would seem to me that it's to my benefit and the benefit of the goals that I have is to get as many people following me as possible, wanting to do the same thing. So, in your research or in your belief, are these images and these symbols and these memes are they deliberately thrown out there by people with with exactly this in mind to try to maybe indoctrinate's the wrong word, but to attract people to adopt these identities to further larger goals, or is it random?
I think there's some. Well, I think there's evidence for both. I think some leaders are very gifted messengers. So Donald Trump is definitely gifted in packaging into these memes very strong, appealing things that have the power to rouse crowds and inspire them to do and say things that they might not have otherwise. And any movement would feel kind of fortunate to have one of these people in their midst. So,
Hmm.
in America, also, I don't know how versed you are in kind of politics of America right now, but this Lincoln Project, is a collection of Republicans, former Republicans. They also call themselves Never Trumpers, and what they do is they try to counterbalance the
Hmm.
scale of memes. They produce um, internet messengers, including like slogans on T-shirts and coffee mugs, but also videos and images and things like that against Trump. So there's definitely some concerted effort to churn those out in service of radicalizing a mass identity. But then there are also some kind of lucky coincidences, like La Marseillaise, which was a commissioned song, and the person who was tasked with doing it just went around Strasbourg, a French city, and looked at some graffiti on the walls and cobbled together a song in like one night. And it turned out to have been like a fantastic meme. And I think rumors are kind of folklore, so they may start out with somebody throwing out a general suggestion that maybe somebody is a pedophile, some politician is a pedophile.
Hmm.
And then that suggestion, like a snowball, it grows
Hmm.
details. And uh, by virtue of spreading from person to person, it just becomes kind of cemented in a particular form that is especially virulent, we may say, or especially potent. as a
Which,
meme.
of course, is the whole QAnon, right? That there's this guy, this Q, that somehow
Hmm.
has the keys to the kingdom, and he's trying to convince the world that a bunch of satanic pedophiles are running Washington, and that true Americans have to stand up against them. I have to admit, Sophia, as a Canadian, uh, looking at the Trump phenomenon in your country over the past 4 years, we just kind of shake our heads sometimes and wonder how it is that, oh, yeah, someone who has obviously got a certain degree of charisma has been able to attract, and not just attract, but grow a community. I mean, half of Americans voted for Trump despite his record over the last 4 years. Um, I want to take this in a slightly different direction now. I'm not sure if you can weigh in on this, but one thing that I've always realized, again, working in security intelligence, is that the vast majority of people that post things online or say things online or like things or repost them or share them, whatever, aren't real serious actors. They're not people you really need to worry about. We used to, call these people those that talk the talk versus those that walk the walk. Obviously, those that are going to do something are of a much greater priority because they are potentially very, very violent people. Is there anything in the research that you and Clark have done that gets at any kind of answer as to how we differentiate between those that really aren't serious about any of this versus the small minority that are going to go on and plan something violent? Or is that something that you guys haven't had a chance to look at yet?
Right. So this is kind of like a little bit like, can we
Yeah,
profile a
profiles are a
terrorist
problematic word, but
from
yeah,
what
I
they
think you were
post
going with this. Yeah.
online? Right. Right. So this is going to be an ongoing investigation, as we are so very new to the world where people probably engage in the majority of their communication on online, on social media, right? So we definitely don't have a definitive answer. We do have enough cases, and some of these cases Clark and I profiled, of people whose radicalization took place primarily online. And they progressed from occasionally visiting some radical groups' websites and watching some sermons to then seeking out specific radicalizing content, such as beheadings, or some atrocities against Muslims, for thinking about a particular example here. Um, and then they sought a way to contribute financially to radical groups around the world. And then finally, they graduated to actually physically going out to find people from these groups to join them with the purpose of contributing to the jihad, to the fight. So it is definitely possible to radicalize online. How many people who get to the radical content will actually do something is a good question. The chances are very few. And so we like to separate in our research on radicalization, we like to separate radicalization in opinion from radicalization
Mm-hmm.
in action. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so most people, as you say, are going to be talkers. They're going to be calling on others to join the fight and shaming them for not doing so, but themselves are, they probably will just be couch warriors.
Mm-hmm.
But that is not to say that we shouldn't worry about them,
Mm-hmm.
because these few individuals who do act, they don't exist in a vacuum, and they, as
Right.
we
Right.
all, are influenced, sometimes very much influenced, by opinions of others in their media. And these
Mm-hmm.
media now include the internet. And
Mm-hmm.
so there's one study that I find fascinating where they took Gallup polls. So these are representative polls of a large number of people in, I believe, 6 countries in Middle East and North Africa. And they, on these Gallup polls, among questions that they asked them were questions about how they felt about leadership in a number of Western giants like Japan. Um, um, shouldn't have said Western and then Japan, but let's say superpowers. Okay, so
Mm-hmm.
Japan, USA, England, Germany, France, and so on. So they got an average of a public opinion from thousands of people, right? And then they compared data on the number of terrorist attacks that originated from these different countries in Middle East and North Africa. Now, clearly, people who carried out the attacks were not the same people who were answering Gallup questions, but there was a significant positive correlation between how negative, pejorative public opinion of the Western leadership was, and the number of terrorist attacks against that superpower.
Mm-hmm.
So the actors, terrorists, radicals, even though they didn't participate in the questionnaire, somehow got the idea that there is widespread public support for this kind of radical action. And it probably contributed to their willingness to act. And so I don't think it's a good idea to police speech in any way, being an American, but I think it's important for policymakers and researchers and security people to understand how important and how sensitive this area of online radicalization is, and that we should pay it attention and understand it a little better than we do now, and maybe catch these memes before they proliferate, maybe counter them in some way.
Well, you're preaching to the choir here. I mean, obviously, in my time in security intelligence, we were very much aware of the online environment. But I was very, happy to hear you sort of back me up in that. I've always thought this notion of self radicalization has been an unfortunate myth that gets carted out all the time by politicians. Because if a person who truly self radicalizes is essentially impossible to detect because they're in their own bubble. What, as you say, you're part of networks. You just raised something at the very end that I want to pick up on as well. And you talked about this a little bit at the conference. You said how these mass identity memes could actually help counter some of the memes that are being used to radicalize, in other words, either to de-radicalize or undermine the radicalization process. Can you step us through some examples of what you found of these images where actually the counter effect was found?
Right. So I have three examples for which we actually have data to support the claim that memes can not only radicalize but also de radicalize. And two of these are images, and one is a symbol. So the two images are photographs. One is the really famous photo of a Vietnam girl running naked from a blazing fire during the Vietnam War. And it became iconic, meaning even if I describe it to you, you probably have it in your mind's eye, but if I show it to an American, a vast majority of them would have seen it before.
Right.
And so it seemed that this image had a huge effect on turning Americans against the war. I mean, there were other things building up to the point when the image appeared, but it kind of had this consolidating litmus test kind of reaction. And President Nixon at the time, he sensed that the image posed this danger, and so he tried to put a dent in the public outcry about the photo by saying that perhaps maybe the image was altered in some way.
Fake news, fake news. Where we heard
Right,
that U.S. president
exactly,
before?
right. And wouldn't you know that this maneuver failed spectacularly when the photographer responded in press by saying, quote, "The horror of the Vietnam War recorded by me did not have to be fixed."
Hmm.
And the war ended that same year. More
Wow.
recently, we had a photo that became famous from Europe of a little boy who drowned and his body washed up on the
Hmm.
beach in Greece. He was in a group of Syrian refugees. And this
Hmm.
photo had changed the rhetoric in Europe about the Syrian refugee crisis. And we know that the photo had that effect because if we look at the average daily amount of donations to the Red Cross for the cause of Syrian refugees in Europe, it was 55 times greater in the week following the release of the photograph than in the weeks prior. And at the same time, as we
Wow.
see this huge increase in donations, we also see the number of Google searches for words Syria, refugee, and Avlan, which is the name of the little boy, go up like a geometric progression. So we know that it was
Hmm.
the photo that actually resulted in this huge change of heart. And the last meme that I talked about at the conference that has the power to kind of bring out the good, not just the bad, is the very familiar crucifix, which is a symbol of Christianity. So we have several studies that show that when people are exposed to it, however fleetingly, they tend to listen to the better angels of their nature, so to speak. So one study in France, they found that individuals are willing to sign up to be organ donors when the person soliciting the donation wears a Christian cross. And another study done in Chile found that when people play an economic game that measures their cooperation in a chapel, they are more cooperative than when play the same game in a lecture hall. So we have, two images and a symbol and evidence to suggest that memes, in fact, have a way of de-radicalizing, turning people away from violence, away from selfishness, and toward better things.
That's fascinating. You refer to the photo of the little boy. I think it was Ilan Kurdi, was he was called in the press. I'll never forget seeing that photograph and seeing this, because he reminded me so much of my son at that age, and it was very emotional, as you said, that this little boy, through no fault of his own, was simply trying to flee with his parents for a better life, and he ended up drowning on a beach. And I think you're right. I think it tore at a lot of people's heartstrings at the time.
Mhm.
Sophia, before I let you go, is there anything that sort of where your research program is taking you now? Are there more work on this particular aspect of radicalization and the use of memes? Or are there other things that you, or perhaps you and Clark Macaulay together, are looking at?
Well, I think once we started digging into the mass identity, it's just such an untapped resource for psychologists. It's a new frontier, really, because in the end of like 19th century, beginning of 20th century, psychologists really went all out with individual psychology. So Freud started that, and then it grew
Hmm.
out of that. And then after World War II, when we tried to understand group psychology, that's when social psychology developed, and Milgram
Hmm.
experiments and
Hmm.
Ash experiments out of that. But I think we had very little handle on math psychology, not least because we couldn't really study it very well. How do you study math psychology? But I think now, with the advent of social media, we have access to so much data that really the hardest thing is to decide which segment of it do we want to focus on first. So that's the direction that we're taking right now.
Okay, an unfair question, and I think I know the answer to this because you are an American and I'm a Canadian with fairly similar laws, not 100% the same. One of the big questions that's being, or one of the big pressures rather, that's being placed on Twitter and Facebook and 4chan and all these other online platforms is to identify and take down some of these images, some of these memes that are clearly leading towards violence, or at least potential for violence. And yet that flies in the face of freedom of expression, freedom of speech, your First Amendment, our Charter of Rights and Freedoms in Canada. How do we better do this? I mean, is Pepe the Frog? But should we take all his images down because of what it means? Should we take down MAGA hats from the internet? I mean, where's that line between allowing people to express their opinions versus trying to at least diminish or decrease the possibility we're going to have acts of violence that occur down the road, in part based on this identity issue?
Right. Well, thank God I'm not a policymaker. So what I say doesn't really matter all that much. Um, I mean, I think freedom of speech is really important, and having grown up in the Soviet Union, it, I really think freedom of
Right.
speech is
And
very
understandably so, absolutely.
right, is very important. So my first instinct is to say we have to work around it rather than suspend it. At the same time, I have seen in my upbringing and in my work how powerful some of these symbols and memes can be. And I know that, for example, in Germany, they have banned a lot of songs and symbols and hand gestures
Mhm.
and things like that after World War II.
Right.
So I know that it can work, and banning some things that maybe we can demonstrate convincingly are
Mhm.
responsible for radicalization. Um, I think the first step that we really should take is kind of in the direction that Twitter has taken, where they post kind of a banner across a tweet that is
Like a
blatantly
warning in a way.
right, right. So at the very least, it will undercut this ability of MIMS to create a false impression that everybody is agreeing with them. So if you see a painted swastika on the wall, you kind of think not just about the person who painted it, but also all the people who went by and did nothing, said nothing, didn't paint over it.
Mhm.
And putting a warning or a label would at least cut some of that power from MIMS.
Mhm.
I think Twitter could probably do better than it's doing at the moment, but I think they're going in the right direction, and I think that's
Well,
a good step.
yeah, they certainly are, as I said, under increasing pressure around the world to do this. But I'm with you in a sense that, well, and who decides? Whose decision do we go with based on what? And do we end up? And of course, we do know that in many states, you alluded to your upbringing in the Soviet Union. There are still far too many states around the world that ban whatever they want, whether it's opposition parties in Africa that are
Mhm.
being taken offline because of the threat they pose to. So it undermines democracy, it undermines all kinds of things. Sophia, this has been an absolutely fascinating conversation. I'm so glad that I had the chance to listen to you in Vancouver last week. I just want to thank you for taking the time and sharing these ideas with my listeners. It is as you said, I think it's a largely untapped area that we need a better understanding of as we try to grapple with this notion as to why people, a very small number of people, we must stress, end up undertaking acts of violence that are ideologically motivated, and a part of it is because they identify with groups that believe in this. So thank you very much for taking the time today.
Thank you so much.
So that was my conversation with Sophia Moskalenko. I'm curious what you guys think. Do you have experience in this regard? What do you think about online memes? What do you think about what Twitter and Facebook should do? You can drop me a line on email, borealisrisk@gmail.com, or on Twitter @borealisaves. You can also reach me on LinkedIn and on Facebook. If you like the content, want to get more, go to my website, borealisthreatrisk.com. Hit the subscribe button, provide your email address, you'll get a free daily digest, all the blogs, all the podcasts every day. Love to hear from you. I'll talk to you again soon. Until then, stay safe.